Mabuhay everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to the afternoon session of the day one of our conference entitled Indigenous Responses to Colonial Incursions. This event is in celebration of the 26th anniversary of the University of the Philippines Archaeological Studies Program and the quincentenary of Magellan's arrival in the Philippines. This event is absolutely free for all, so we don't charge fees of any kind. Again, I am Liz Aldiano from UP Archaeological Studies Program, your host for this event. And to officially start the second session of the conference, and for those who were not able to attend the morning session, let me introduce the moderator for session two. Our moderator is a PhD in anthropology graduate from the Department of Anthropology and Geography in University of the Illinois, Chicago, USA, with specializations in remote sensing and geographic information system methods in archaeology. Currently an associate professor in UP-ASP. Please welcome, and I'm going to pass the mic to Dr. Michael Armand P. Canilao. Sir Mix.
Thank you, Liz. Liz is actually one of our field schoolers, and she's also in one of the courses I'm teaching. She's enrolled in History of Archaeology. It's great to see you in this context. Magandang hapon lahat ng mga participants po natin. Before we proceed with session 2, just a correction. Our professor this morning who presented, si Professor De La Vega, or sorry, Jose De Vega, actually finished his abogasya pero wala pa raw pong lisensya. So, Professor, magandang hapon po. Okay, so for this afternoon, we have 4 presenters. We will start off with our professor from who has a PhD in education, Dr. Rosella Torrecampo, followed by John Hontanar, Professor Roland Macawili, and Ruben Reyes IV. Let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Rosella M. Torrecampo. She is an AB English, magna cum laude, and she also has an MA in comparative literature, a thesis with high distinction, graduate of the University of the Philippines, Diliman. She has a doctorate in education leadership with a dissertation on curriculum design responsive to today's education environment crisis, informed by brain-based learning, education, and public administration from the Graduate School of Public Development and Management of the Development Academy of the Philippines. When it was yet undefended, her study already won for her two separate Best Student Papers and Best Presenter awards in both Civic Society-based and UP Asian Institute Graduate Student Research Conference and Colloquium, in the latter which she also completed as an outsider to UP. Her studies, officially deployed training in ASEAN QA, helped inform her UP sustained academic excellence QA work. I believe that's quality assurance. Correct me if I'm wrong. Her 35 years in language and literature teaching in UP is complemented by being an institutional and corporate communications trainer and technical writer and editing practice at local, national, and international levels, including doing resolutions writing training for the ASEAN Interparliamentary Assembly. Since 2000, she has taken certification exams to hold an international English language testing system examiner license from the University of Cambridge Local Examination Syndicate, which licenses her to test, rate, design, training, and train for English proficiency internationally. She is a trainer for the British Council and currently a communication consultant for the DENR, the DILG, and its local government academy arm. Administrative posts she held are DECL, CAL, Assistant Chair, UP VP for Public Affairs, PDA, Programs Development Associate of the Office for Academic Support and Instructional Services, concurrent program chair for the Diploma in Language and Literacy and the Masters in Education from UP Open University, assistant registrar and
And we're
director,
live.
and eventually PDA of the Office of the Advancement of Teaching for both UP Diliman. She is engaged in local history, culture and folklore research and publication, initially as the subject of her MA thesis, and writes and publishes poetry locally and abroad. She has authored a grammar and writing textbook, handbooks, resources, including for a USAID project, language teaching videos produced by the UP Open University, Commission on ICT, now DICT, and the CHED Masterclass project. Print and e-vision, or versions rather, of the UNESCO book based on her dissertation and lecture at the latest UNESCO UNICEF International Inclusion, Mobility, and Multicultural Language Education Conference, 11 poems related to COVID coming out in local and international publications, a book on the UP academic costume, the Sablay, and an NCCA publication grant book, an anthology and analysis of selected folk tales of Silang Cavite are her 2021 publications. And I believe she'll be presenting about Silang Cavite today. So let us warmly welcome Professor Torrecampo. Magandang hapon po.
Yes. Magandang hapon po. Wag niyo nang i-memorize yan. And isa lang ang sasabihin ko po, lower your expectations. Okay, kala ko iigsian niyo po yung binigay ko eh. Salamat po. So may I start now by sharing my screen?
Yes, please po.
Okay. So while the talk is long and therefore will require more than just this condensed version, I am already warning people that we will be having a look at the entire set of trope making for this particular set of texts presented, but not necessarily that this has anything to do with the book on the analysis of folktales from Silang. So that approached text using a structural perspective, whereas now we will be looking at that very same structure and putting all different forms together in order to produce a more post-colonial take on things. Before I start, pagbati sa ASP sa inyong anibersaryo po. So my Tagalog, Turning Tropes Against Colonial Impositions, the Trop presentation limits its assumptions to that town in Cavite called Silang. And it is one of those earliest colonized, and maybe we might say thoroughly colonized by the Spanish incursion. However, we might see that colonization is reacted to normally as something to be in excess, to be ad nauseam, unwanted, or unwelcome. And therefore, this paper takes a look at how we can interrogate perhaps that assumption that there was a purely benevolent response to assimilation, expressed as syncretism, illustrated by folk Catholicism through the tropes that we can find in the texts from Silang Cavite, and see that there could be some expressions of subversiveness. And in that subversiveness, an agendum of ethnocentrism intent on somehow celebrating or recovering its sense of identity and ethos. A trope is seen as a bundle of relations that would have some meaning. It is very much like the Levi-Straussian concept of methemes, as a bundle of significance that can be read not only from narratives, but in this case, across different forms of texts that will include tala or autobiographical diary writing, that is, folk tales and legends, as well as even what would be a folk song and material culture like iconography and the Virgin herself as locus. In trope making, we see that there is an articulation of these devices, not only for linguistic purposes or for aesthetic purposes, but really this will be seen as an articulation of native identity as an act of interrogating the colonialism that they have experienced, reappropriating that sense of identity and recuperating thereby. From the texts of Silang Cavite, and I'm treating everything as text to read, typical of a complete major, there are material artifacts like the church or the retablo of the Nuestra Senora de Candelaria, now considered as a national treasure, the very retablo that Imelda once wanted for herself, yes, and the people fought to keep, and in the hagiography, or the legends and folktales that presuppose a biography of the Nuestra Senora de Candelaria, and even in the way she has been carved, they say, in the iconography, you will see that there is an assertion already of somebody who is a homebound person, a silang-bound native. Why is that so? Because she is presented as a native, like a 14-year-old mother dressed in simple white flowing robes, inviting people to her town, acting very much like the resident hostess. In some cases of the cycle of legends about her, she is seen as warning native fighters like guerrillas against the Japanese, and at times even talking to the NPA themselves and to the Japanese in order to drive them away from the town in the most peaceful manner she could, which is through dialogue. So while there are two renditions of the Candelaria in the Silang Church, one that is inside and very much the Madonna, the foreign gay-looking virgin, the one who is cemented and encased in the facade of the church is considered the original and the more miraculous thereby. So in that sense, we will see here an assertion already of how the Candelaria is supposed to be an assertion of native identity more than it should bear with it the marks of colonization. Then, from the text, apart from the legends of the Candelaria, we will see that there are local heroes that legends talk of. There is Tabing, who is also known as Cirilo, there is Tandang Jose, and there is Maria. So these are all healers, native personages of power who can prophesy. Not only that, bend nature to do their will. They can make rain fall on one side, but not on another side of that same area, or make bamboo do their bidding by just commanding it to bend at will. So they are seen as persons of power, not necessarily deities, but counterpoints to the Jesuit colonizers who were rumored to have a book of magic, so-called in legend as the Librong Itim ng Aswita. Okay, and it's not Jesuita, but Aswita, something interesting. It's almost like aswang, no, in its beginning of the spelling, but yes, the Aswita sa kumbento. So counterpoint to this Librong Itim, they have the orality of their bulongs as oraciones of power in order to respond to the needs of people when it comes to their dealing with the supernatural. Of course, Maria was known to also practice the carving and the pag-aalay of native tau-tauhan, small images carved in wood which are floated upriver in order to have some sort of ally in order to get responses from the heavens. So these are not to be mistaken for the small Catholic icons carved like the Santo Niño, but actually native icons that are counterpoint this time to the Catholic icons. And this kind of practice was known to persist even sometime up to the 60s or so. The founding legend of Silang, where it asserts an earlier founding date to 1595, talks of Gathingiw and his son Gat Pandan. Gat Pandan is the father of Silang, who made an establishment antedating colonization. Then there is the tale of the wandering Jesuit, which proves to be interesting because here it shows the persistence of foolishness out of misunderstanding when the wandering Jesuit mistakenly names things out of his not knowing how to communicate and how the native language works. In the legend about the naming of towns, here we will also see some ethnocentrism at work because all those who are not from Silang are given names that will be a little bit of slurs. So for example, those from Bataan are actually Alipin, aka Bataan. Those who are from Pampanga, with excuses, that was their time and their context, are Pampangs or prostitutes. And those from Bulacan are of course field workers, whereas those from Silang are seen as people who celebrate the founding of their town through birth. And then, of course, there is this set of legends where the toponym or the naming of a place was lalaan. So many people think it's about having weaving there as an industry, or pinya as that which would supply the weaving, or the loom. However, this is actually a contraction of the native language, where when a stranger asks, ano ang pangalan ika ng lugar na ito? The people would answer habitually, collectively, ay lalaan, meaning, I do not know anything, ala akong nalalaan, which is a subversive response, if we may say so, to those who would want to come into their territory. Certainly it is ethnocentric, and in many ways can be seen as that which fueled the clannishness and the cavitismo in later times. Now, here are samples, or the full text, in fact, of the legend that I was talking to you about, which when we, of course, send, I hope, the presentation to one and all, that you could have the leisure of reading, because for now, there is, of course, our time constraints. Now, beyond the text, there is a body of knowledge and lore that people in Silang call Erihia. Now, here is where colonization really puts its foot down, because during that time when the colonizers asserted that all of native tradition is supposed to be evil, from the devil, and therefore should be rejected, should be forgotten, no? And therefore should be called heresy as a whole, the people of Silang, in maybe a self-deprecating way, if not actually what would be seen as a sort of nonchalance. They couldn't care less what they call it. They could embrace the term herejia for all they care, and therefore in a Filipino corrupted version, the erihia. But for so long as they held on to their native belief systems as the collective corpus of their truth and their faith, they could call it heresy for all we care, turning the term around from something negative into something appropriated as positive. This assimilation into folk Catholicism has certain expressions through persistence and ubiquity, because even up to now, some of these pamahiin, paniniwala, kasabihan, circulate around time and around town. Now, in the ritual of kapatiran, however, here we see really something operating outside the locus of Catholic dogma, and therefore, I'm very sure that the clerics would have raised a hue and cry about the practice if they had caught on to it, or if they had witnessed it. But in the ritual of kapatiran, people would usually dry the umbilical cords of their children, and when the brood is all together formed, they would powder this and sprinkle it liberally over nilugaw, and the children would partake of it, so that in many ways it would be an empowering, binding ritual, so that, again, the clan, the family, the culture stays together. So the belief in encantos and manggagaway and other worldly personages and events might also be seen as something persistent well outside Catholic dogma, but in their persistence and practice will be a form of reaction against the incursion. And then, of course, there is this folk song, Doon Po Samin, the Silang variant, where if you look at it, you will see, I would just want to show you the variant first. Sorry, there, that song, where you will see how the lines are drawn between self and others, where there is already a definition of how colonialism might have impacted the old status quo. Here we see the act of a stranger destroying that which gave it shelter or which gave it nurturing, and therefore here we see a sort of pananagoy, or a sort of statement about how those who came in are intent on damage and have no utang na loob, so to speak. So terms like what would be kaungkon, nanunulungan, and sisilong are terms associated with empathy and are appropriated by the home and the self participants, whereas sinumang tao, tinaga, inalis ang sanga, pinatay, or siyang pumatay, are those associated with the others. By the way, from Silang, we call ourselves Tagalog also. And those who are from Kawit, for example, are the others, and Tagababa o Taga-Ibayo. So all of these might be seen in the words of the song as an impact-laden statement regarding incursion. Then again, from the texts, or we call them tala, here is an excerpt of Tiponero writing from what would be a recording of the event when the revolution was supposed to break out in Silang already. So in our relay translation, the original text could have read, "May paparating na mga malalaking taong malalapad ang tainga, and from them the nation or the town should be defended." So in the excerpt of that writing, here we see in the English version that that morning a civil guard saw a sort of commotion. He sent another civil guard to see what was going on. And when this civil guard investigated, he was told by the people, "Oh, there are big men with wide ears who are coming and we should protect the town from them," without knowing that this is a trope in itself, because from those texts, we will see how the revolutionaries were able to talk above the head of the one making the inquiry in a form of using local idiom as argot with double entendre as its mechanism. So in the end, the guy who was asking around did not even realize that he was being called chismoso, and that the people were telling themselves that they will be defending themselves against people like him. So up to now, such use of argot can be witnessed or seen operating, according to Chino Marlo Sayuno in his 2019 presentation, where he says in Amadeo there is also a dialect variant that maybe cannot be understood as Filipino or Tagalog, but actually uses Tagalog as the basis of its coding. So in Amadeo, they use this to see who are the outsiders and the insiders, they say. So when somebody says, "Gasime al nagpage," and you don't get it, that parine at magkape, then clearly you mark yourself to be an outsider. So given that, we will see that the tropes are used to arm language, and language operates as arms in a way. So using the Filipino methods of communication that would delineate insider versus outsider, the communicatively competent versus the not, the parinig, pasaring, paramdam, panunodyo, in many ways, we give language an edge that goes over the other's head, and wordplay becomes subtle swordplay towards pakikiisa, pagiging kapatid, katropa, o kaangkan. Tropes to arm language may be seen as analogous to texts on the surface, drawing from different forms, narratives like legends and folktales, historical accounts, the lexicon or glossary, and even material artifacts, but they perform the homologous function of providing the community or society with acceptable, because subtle, sub rosa, yet subversive ways of dealing with colonial incursion. Tropes to arm language might be seen as trope making, or the use of tropes, not just as a show of linguistic proficiency, but especially in an idiomatic facility and creative capacity as a way of interrogating the status quo, drawing lines between the local and the foreign other, articulating the differences or separation between spheres, and appropriating or arrogating meaning, enabling re-articulation of their territory, belief systems, and their people's sense of identity and the collective ethos. Salamat po.
Thank you so much, Professor Torrecampo. And I actually want to thank you also for being my professor in the teaching effectivity course in 2020. I can't forget the dessert buko pandan at ISSI. Thank you, ma'am. Okay, we will have our open forum later for all your questions addressed to our speakers this afternoon, session 2. At this point, let us proceed to our next speaker. We have Professor John Ray Hontanar, who is a literary scholar and a proud feminist, born and raised on the magical island of Panay in Western Visayas. He holds a master's degree in comparative literature and specialized in queer literature and the Babaylanic studies. He is currently teaching literary theory and art criticism courses at the Division of Humanities in UP Visayas. So let us all welcome Professor Hontanar. Magandang hapon po.
Hello, sir.
Hi.
Hello, everyone. Congratulations for this historical event. I will just share my screen. Okay. Maayong hapon from Iloilo City. I am Ray Hontanar from UP Visayas, and it is an honor to present my study on Agi poetry. Agi-agi, may putay sa dahi. Or gay-gay, you have a vagina in your forehead. This derogatory phrase has been passed down from one generation to another, crystallizing the grip of the patriarchal hegemony in Panayanan society. If we unpack this common slur, we can see how kaagian is deeply connected with femininity. Thus, the agi's oppression and othering can be explained by patriarchy's fear and hatred towards this very femininity. To those who are not familiar with this local gender identity, the Agi is an indigenous model of homosexuality in Panay and is distinctly known as an effeminate man. Although he acknowledges that he is physically male in terms of emotion, the Agi feels like a woman, and in terms of desire, he wants or he craves for a masculine man. The Agi suffers from different layers of oppression because it deviates from the image of the macho Christian heterosexual. The rapid modernization of Panayanan society led to the influx of Western concepts of gender identity. Many homosexuals no longer identify as Agi. Instead, they label themselves as gays, bisexuals, transgenders, queers, etc. So these categories within the LGBTQ community situate the Agi in the lower ranks of the echelon, while modern and Western embodiments of sexuality are considered more superior. Unlike his Baklak sister, the Agi remains nativist and unqueered, borrowing from Butler, and the indigenous spatiality of Panay explains this embodiment of self. I will try to elucidate as we go along. Recently, literary scholars have noticed a rising trend in Western Visayan literature, which is the articulation of Babaylanic elements in literary productions. The rise of Babaylanic imagery in contemporary Western Visayan literature becomes a conscious post-colonial project among Western Visayan writers to empower the literary transmutations of the Agi and to understand the practices, peculiarities, and enduring belief systems from an indigenous standpoint. The study uses the Panayanan concept of power called gahum in analyzing kaagian, since I believe Western frames of theorizing can never fully comprehend the local constructions of identity, a native framework is necessary. The study postulates that Babaylanism, or the belief in the powers of the Babaylan, is utilized in Agi poetry. Born in the mid-90s after the unfurling of Ledlad in Manila, thanks to Janiel Garcia and Danton Remoto, Agi poetry slowly immortalized the loves and longings of the Agi, or the Baklak's Western Visayan sister. While a full master's thesis on Agi poetry is written by me, this presentation will only discuss two poems that represent the body of work of two self-identified Agi writers. We have John Emil Teodoro, one of the most iconic queer writers in the country, and a rising star in Western Visayan literature, Leonard Francis Alcoran. The Baylan, as we all know, is one of the most powerful entities in the Panayanon cosmology, embodying physical and spiritual powers that go beyond the human realm. The Babaylan is not just a shaman, she was also a medium, a keeper of tradition, and a political icon in pre-colonial times. So the study postulates that the home or power in a Panayanon sense is exemplified in Babaylanism because it harnesses cosmic and divine forces to benefit and safeguard the community. The Agi follows the legacy of the Babaylan as a gender-bending, counter-masculine bearer of culture. Agi writers champion the image of the Babaylan as a symbol of feminine power, free from patriarchal, religious, and colonial influence. I will discuss two of the dominant tropes that I was able to flesh out in my critical study of Agi poetry. First is Kaagian, versus Catholicism, how this indigenous articulation of self engages with the colonial imposed religion. Using the Babaylan as a revolutionary image of nativism and decolonization, Agi poetry challenges Catholicism as a space of absolute patriarchal power. John Remil Teodoro, for example, is one of the early writers who championed gay writing in Western Visayan literature. Inspired by the blossoming of Ladlad in the early 90s, he wrote about the struggles and tragedies of the Agi individual through his favorite and most dominant imagery, the katao. So Teodoros, in his literary works, incorporates mystical and Babaylanic elements immortalized in the collective unconscious of Panayanan society to challenge patriarchal and religious forces. He frames these entities like the Katao as guardians of nature, occupying animistic feminine spaces that embody the Babaylanic Gahum. I'll give an example of this poem here entitled In Tatlong Babaylan ng Pag-ibig or Three Babaylans of Love. Teodoro incorporates the Babaylanic in the discourse of Kaagian. So the persona's poignant declaration, wala tayong karapatang magmahal kapag sumikat ang araw, articulates how hegemonic systems of power, especially the church, invalidate homosexuality. You know, Catholic doctrines champion heterosexuality and heteronormativity, and behaviors outside those qualifications, those classifications, are deemed abnormal. So Teodoro continues to describe the persona's subjugation in the following lines. Kalaban ng tibok ng ating mga puso ang mga batas ng pamahalaan, simbahan at lipunan. Walang pangalan ng ating pagsinta sapagkat marami ang kumokontra. He describes how Kaagian is a name in these patriarchal spaces where masculine rules define the world in binaries. So there's male, female, self, other, good, evil, etc., etc. So the church holds the greatest power, influencing every single aspect of life. Since Babaylanic tradition is threat to Catholic patriarchal supremacy, the amalgamation of the Agi, the Gamhanan, and the Babaylan elements functions as the ultimate symbol of religious subversion. In the following lines, the persona harnesses Babaylanic powers that challenge the omnipotence of the church. Kayang-kaya nating pasabugin ang buong daigdig. Hawak natin ang lupa, dagat at ulap. Lumalakas ang ating kapangyarihan sa bawat lungkot at kabiguang ating madanas. Hala, maghawak kamay na tayo, itakda na natin sa isang sumpa ang katapusan ng langit at lupa. The presence of a powerful feminine image in literature decentralizes Catholic supremacy. Teodoro uses animistic elements and frames darkness as a space of the feminine other. The dark, in a Babaylanic sense, rebels against the Catholic demonization of such space. So Teodoro's persona in his poems reveal that the Panayanans believe that the Babaylan holds power that positions them as almost divine. As a post-colonial project, Teodoro's poetry veers away from hegemonic definitions of power by unearthing and celebrating the Panayanans' gender fluidity, animism, and Babaylanic practices. So let's proceed to another trope explored in the study, which is Kaagian and animism. As one of the emerging voices in contemporary Kinaraya literature, Leonard Francis Alcoran's poetry displays a strong endurance of a paganistic memory embedded in Antioqueño culture. His poetry zine entitled Kinaraya, published in 2019, critiques the supremacy of capitalism and Catholicism in the modern age. His poetry explores sexuality and superstition in juxtaposition with the physical and cultural explorations of his homeland. In the province of Antique, on the island of Panay, many people still retain the old ways and have a strong inclination towards animistic and babaylanic practices. In Paghiwit, a short eight-liner poem that navigates around the struggles of a persona wanting to break free from the pains of unrequited love. Al-Quran here opens the poem with a very babaylanic image, the persona dancing under a lunok tree, invoking supernatural spirits to heal him from the hiwit, or the curse of unrequited love. Tubtub karon ako maghinugyaw sa idalom kang lunok, pagkatawgo ng mga sorog nga baskog, si pagsalig, pagtuo, kag pagpadayon. Imitating the trance-like performance of the Babaylan, the persona spirals back to the primordial animist faith to find healing and solitude. So here, Al-Quran incorporates the concept of daga, an offering of blood or food to ask favor from the spirits of nature. Akon karon pagkatagaon ang kasubo, kag ihalad ang sapal na dinaraha sa luha, agud mayad ako sa pagkahiwit, kang mapintas na nga tagipusuan. The home in Al-Quran's poetry is positioned within the animistic and babaylanic space, as the persona ignores any scientific or Catholic incantations and practices in his healing process. It reveals that despite centuries of colonization, babaylanic practices are deeply embedded in Kinaraya culture, playing an important role in the shaping of the cosmology and reality of contemporary Antiqueños. Al-Quran's depiction of the Babaylanic Gahum veers away from Catholic portrayal of the feminine as dark, monstrous, and evil. As a young writer, the youngest among Western Visayan writers to win a Palanca, the strong presence of Babaylanic elements in Leonard Al-Quran's poetry shows the endurance of old ways within the people's collective memory. So how does the Babaylanic Gahum emancipate and decolonize the representation of kaagian in literature? The powerful presence of animism in Agi poetry shows the triumph of a Babaylanic memory despite centuries of colonization that stripped the Agi of his powerful voice. Framing kaagian as close to nature, the empowerment of the Agi from a once marginalized voice is synonymous to the acknowledgement of nature as a space of power. The animist projection of power continuously clashes and challenges the male-centric tradition and colonial approaches by the Catholic Church. The evocation of the Babaylan figure in Agi poetry provides liberation through disengagement from colonial and patriarchal trauma. Using the Babaylan as a mystic healer and leader challenges patriarchal and religious hegemonies. Agi poetry carries the Babaylanic tradition in the form of feminized, animistic, and anti-patriarchal performances of the Agi. I'd like to end this presentation by showing an artwork by Genesis Ala depicting the Babaylan, an enduring and inspiring feminist and queer figure across time. The Babaylan symbol is an ideal metaphor for feminist and the queer movement because it rejects patriarchal and colonial core values through a strong and conscious construction of Babaylanic imagery. Agi poetry creates a new cultural understanding that decolonizes and emancipates the discourse of kaagian in literature. So Agi poetry teaches us that may we all carry the strength and magic of our Babaylan foremothers as we fight oppressive forces that continue to colonize our minds and subjugate our bodies. Thank you for listening and have a great day.
Thank you so much, Professor Hontanar. I must commend you for a very nice background with a matching shirt. Thank you for joining us all the way from UP Visayas. We will have our open forum for questions you may have for Professor Hontanar.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Before we proceed, I'd like to again recognize our conference committee under the leadership of Director Lee Anthony Neri and the head Ellie Lim, Liz Aldiano, Jane Carlos, Ara Espigar, and Ana Pineda. Our next speaker, Professor Roland Macawili, finished his Bachelor of Arts in History in the Polytechnic University of the Philippines and is currently finishing his Master of Arts in Philosophy in the Divine Word Mission Seminary. He taught in the Polytechnic University of the Philippines and Adamson University. His recent publications include articles titled Katawang Babae at ang Imahenaryo ng Nasyon and Si Rizal, ang Manok at ang Mito. He is currently a museum curator in Batangas State University. Let us all welcome Curator Roland Macawili. Magandang hapon po.
Hello, magandang hapon sa inyong lahat at sana'y maginhawa kayo ngayon, ano? So, first let me share some slides. So, my paper is entitled Hermeneutics or A Hermeneutics of Ginhawa, Interrogations on a Filipino Concept. Una sa lahat, inaalay ko ang papel na ito kay Padre Roque Ferriols na isa sa mga pinagsumikapang kapakapain ang filosofiyang Filipino. So this paper is a paper on Filipino philosophy. Let me start this paper by quoting Andres Bonifacio. In Ang Dapat Mabatid ng Mga Tagalog, Bonifacio has summarized the history of the Philippines prior to Conquista through this statement. Itong Katagalugan na pinamamahalaan ng unang panahon ng ating tunay na mga kababayan niyong hindi pa tumutuntong sa mga lupaing ito ang mga Kastila ay nabubuhay sa lubos na kasaganaan at kaginhawaan. Kasundo niya ang mga kapitbayan at lalong-lalo na ang mga taga-Hapon, sila'y kabilihan at kapalitan ng mga kalakal, malabis ang pagyabong ng lahat ng pinagkakakitaan, kaya't dahil dito'y mayaman ang kaasalan ng lahat, bata't matanda at 10 mga babae ay marunong sumulat ng talagang pagsulat nating mga Tagalog. Bonifacio's historicizing is replete of nostalgia, which in turn was utilized by Katipunan to legitimize the revolution, or in Zeus Salazar's phraseology, paghahasik ng bagsik against Spain. This longing for the past can also be found in the rhetoric of the propaganda movement. In his edition of Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas of Antonio Morga, for example, Jose Rizal says that while Noli Me Tangere was written to narrate the condition or estado actual of the Philippines, Rizal's project through Sucesos was to show the shadows of our ancestors' civilization, or sombra de la civilización de nuestros antepasados. The latter has been considered by Jose Rizal as a prerequisite to study the future, or estudiar de porvenir. If one were to submit to Philippine historiography's craving to dichotomize the vision and ideology of the Katipunan and propaganda movement, he can indeed find differences or points of departure from one another. As victims of cultural schizophrenia, or individuals whose existences can be described as those of what Franz Fanon prominently calls black-skinned white mask, the primary motivation among Ilustrados to study the pre-Hispanic past was to heal the wound in their souls caused by inferiority before the presence of the colonial other, or the Peninsulares. On the other hand, majority of the Katipuneros, as they were called, were never beneficiaries of colonial education. Kaya hindi naman pinitpit sa wikang Espanyol yung mga dila nito mga Katipuneros. Kaya hindi nila problema yung pangiinsulto ng mga Espanyol, no? Tagurian man silang tamad o mga walang utang na loob. A concept has been repeatedly mentioned as a motif in Katipunan's ideology. This is ginhawa or kaginhawaan. The concept serves as a modifier for the past or the lost civilization of our ancestors. Let us go back to Rizal. His edition of Sucesos appears to be a discourse or conversation between the colonizer, Antonio Morga, and the colonized, Rizal, about the latter's identity. By means of the annotation, Rizal denies, rectifies, and sometimes agrees with the Indio identity assigned by Morga. In a great sense, his annotations create assertions of what Rizal and his fellow Ilustrados believe to be the Filipino identity. We cannot see this praxis in Katipunan's historicizing. Wala naman silang paki sa identidad. Wala silang problema sa identidad. They tend to emphasize more the treachery committed by Spain and the destruction of livelihood. So, mas may papakita yung pagtatraidor ng mga Espanyol sa napagkasunduan sa pamagitan ng pinta na ito ni Juan Luna. Okay, so what is ginhawa or kaginhawaan? If we are to analyze how the Katipunan uses the term in its theorizing, ginhawa or kaginhawaan refers to good life. One shall notice it in the pairing of ginhawa with another Tagalog concept, kasaganaan. In the classic book edited by Professor Consuelo Paz, she suggests that ginhawa is the common thread that runs through the ethno-linguistic group's diversities. The said linguist defines ginhawa as is or the feeling of lightness one experiences when everything aspired for is in order or easily attainable. Aside from this, we Tagalog speakers relate ginhawa with the absence of or freedom from anything that tires, troubles, disturbs, or pains. In other languages, in the Philippines, ginhawa refers to breathing in Bicol, Romblomanon, Waray, Cebuano, Aklanon, Hiligaynon, Maranao, etc. Among the Tausug, ginhawa has definition that one might consider philosophical, if not utterly metaphysical. It is the inner part of the person, spirit, the thinking, feeling part of a person as distinguished from the body, mind, intellect, dignity, and self-esteem. Ginhawa can also be found in various cognates in other Austronesian languages. Okay. In Proto-Austronesian, ginhawa's proto-form nisawa means breathing. In Proto-Malayo-Polynesian, to which Philippine languages belong, its proto-form nihawa can also mean the soul or the life-sustaining force. So too is the meaning of ginhawa's proto-form nyawa in Proto-Central Eastern Malayo-Polynesian. Professor Paz adds that ginhawa is measurable by means of anything or by means of material things, achievable by the help from the spirit world and by social interaction within the community, as it is guided and maintained by nature or the environment. Kasaganaan is also studied by Professor Paz in relation to ginhawa. We can equate the experience of kasaganaan with the phrase popularized by El Shaddai, siksig, liglig, umaapaw. Kasaganaan can be measured, or our experiences of it is quantitative in nature. Kasaganaan also has cognates in other Philippine languages, which mean peace and order, and freedom from want or desire. In Vocabulario de la Lengua Tagala by San Benaventura, we notice that ginhawa refers to bodily experience that is related to the absence or presence of an ailment. Ginhawa is both a noun, as in salud, and a verb, as in mejorar. Sagana, on the other hand, is translated as abundancia. Although related and sometimes used interchangeably, we have to underline the difference between these two concepts. Kasaganaan is empirical, while kaginhawaan, at sa puntong ito, medyo kakandirit ako ng very slight lang mula kay Professor Paz. No? Kaginhawaan refers to feeling or state of mind that transcends any kind of measurement. Kaginhawaan, for instance, can be felt if one has masaganing ani ng palay. Ginhawa cannot be reduced to materiality, although the latter is a precondition to achieve the former. One can notice this from the very historicizing by Bonifacio mentioned a while ago. Values, or mayaman na kaasalan, is considered a byproduct or effect of a prosperous livelihood or mayabong na pinagkakakitaan. Both can be regarded as manifestations of ginhawa or kaginhawaan. The former can bring about freedom from any kind of evil, for example, sama ng loob, while the latter can cause the absence of hunger or poverty. Zio Salazar holds that barangay, contrary to the common belief, was an economic entity, a conglomerate of clans whose primary concern was to increase agricultural production, within which four civilizational specializations had to go hand in hand to secure the good of the community. Leadership was the dato's responsibility. The bayani, the defender of the barangay, were often engaged in pangangayaw or headhunting, which is believed to be essential for the continuity of generation in the barangay. Reproduction of domestic animals like pigs and carabaos, and good harvest of palay. In several seasons, their functions was centered in institutionalized maritime raiding, which, as Laura Juncker points out, provided a legitimate alternative source of wealth procurement to tribute mobilization and inter-island trade, and served as a means of effecting considerable economic disruption of adjacent competing coastal trade centers. The Babaylan, the community priestess, had a lot to do in the barangay. She was the expert in matters concerning astronomy, religion, medicine, and even psychiatry. The Panday class comprised those carpenters, artisans, smiths, potters, and those whose living was based on making tools or materials. As Salazar notes, each specialization's importance to the barangay was based on the sole task of ensuring the kaginhawaan of the entire barangay. Here, as one might notice, kaginhawaan does not only refer to comfort or prosperity. More than those, ginhawa or kaginhawaan can now be defined as life itself. Now I shall argue that ginhawa must be felt or enjoyed by the body before anything else. It is this notion that gives ginhawa or kaginhawaan its materialist, not materialistic, materialist flavor. From Katipunan's historicizing up to that of Salazar's, food as source of nourishment is emphasized. Salazar's Baranganic specializations are all gearing toward food security, first and foremost. In Katipunan's theorization, pinagkakakitaan as manifestation of kaginhawaan is indeed needed to access food. The latter is taken here as a source of ginhawa. It is interesting to note, in addition to that in Juan Felix de Encarnacion's dictionary, Visayan dictionary, ginhawa is defined as stomach. From the discussion on ginhawa or kaginhawaan, I would argue that the concept was utilized by the Filipinos to assess colonialism. Colonizers claimed to be the grantor of well-being by means of providing polity and religion to pagans. Colonialism was understood this way by Spanish colonizers at least, but it was not how the natives assessed and interpreted the workings of colonialism. In Katipunan's historicizing, the Hispanic period in Philippine history is a negation of ginhawa or kaginhawaan. Bonifacio rallied in katapusang hibik ng Pilipinas. Wala nang namana itong Pilipinas, nalayaw sa ina kundi nga ang hirap. They understood colonialism by means of the institutions implemented by the Spaniards. One of those is polos y servicios. Polos y servicios can be said to be modeled to satisfy the mercantilist longings of Spanish economy by the time. The natives were taken to far away shipyards to build galleons or to serve as rowers or fighters in Spanish expeditions. This condition resulted to the decrease of agricultural produce, which also yielded famine among those who were left behind. Needless to say, polos y servicios would be the source of hate by the Indios, triggering some early revolts. In Samar, Sumuroy, Juan Ponce, and Pedro Caamo led an uprising against the order, requiring them and their people to go to the shipyards of Cavite. The uprising spread to Albay and Camarines, Cebu, Masbate, and as far as northern Mindanao, but was easily suppressed in 1650 by the combined efforts of the Spaniards and native mercenaries. Another case of uprising occurred in Luzon. Maniago, or Francisco Maniago, led his people to revolt against the government practice of requiring them to cut timber and render service in shipyards in Cavite to build galleons. From the instances mentioned above, one could simply understand that polos y servicios hindered the colonialist project from fully impressing its rhetoric on salvation, well-being, and faith welfare work. Polos y servicios was a negation of attaining ginhawa. It served as a conceptual cornucopia through which Katipunan assessed their colonial experiences. This image of the Hispanic past became the necessary backdrop to underline the necessity to rid the Filipinos from the clout of Spanish colonialism. Ginhawa, in Katipunan's narratives, served as a power concept tool to express the desire of the colonized for a better future by reinforcing an image of the past that was perceived to be better than the status quo they were in. Nostalgia was indeed used to project a better future. That's all. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you so much, Curator Roland Macawili from the Batangas State University. We hope to visit your museum after the pandemic. Let us proceed to our next speaker, one of ASP's very own graduate students, Ruben Claro A. Reyes IV. We commonly call him Kim. He is an aspiring archaeologist with a background in fine arts and a diploma in archaeology from UP-Diliman. He is currently pursuing his master's degree with the UP-ASP with research interest in art studies, visual identities, production techniques, and archaeomusicology. He is also a folk multi-instrumentalist with Raven Kim Woodwinds, focusing on musical antiquity. This is actually one of our coping mechanisms for the pandemic, listening to Kim present in a Facebook Live. So let us all welcome Kim.
Thank
Magandang
you
hapon.
very much, Dr. Canilao. I was actually a student of Dr. Canilao then just a couple of sems back for ethnoarchaeology. So I learned a lot from him. So let me
Thank
just
you.
share my screen. And I'm on slideshow. Yan. So okay ba? Kita yung screen?
Yes, yes.
Thank you. Archaeomusicology. I won't go about defining archaeomusicology because it's in the name. Archaeomusicology, the archaeology of music. What's more important to discuss perhaps is the distinction between archaeomusicology and ethnomusicology. Why do we need archaeomusicology when we have this field of study na ethnomusicology? Whereas ethnomusicology looks at the big picture and the entire practice surrounding the creation of music, archaeomusicology focuses more on the material culture involved in the production of music. So, yung mga instruments na ginagamit, yung mga damit na sinusuot for performances, the places where these take place, those are what are considered in archaeomusicology. I believe it's important to not look at archaeomusicology as a separate discipline from ethnomusicology, rather as a tool that can be employed by ethnomusicologists and archaeomusicologists to approach the subject of music archaeology. There are four things that archaeomusicology specifically can tell us. The first one is time depth. So when we look at the form of material culture of music, makikita mo as it progresses through time, meron siyang evolution. Like in this first example here at the very left, yung evolution from the Renaissance solo flute up to the contemporary Bohem silver flute. And hindi like human evolution, it's not linear na meron ka lang from start to finish, but this has a lot of branches. Second, it can tell us about the persistence and extinction of musical cultures. Yung isang example dito in the picture, isa is in North America, a Native American Yume musician na nagpe-play ng interdental flute. So, unlike dun sa familiar tayo, interdental means being played against the teeth. That's something that we don't see in living cultures anymore. And then yung sa baba, si Mr. Eric Gatawa, who plays a traditional Ifugao Kalaling nose flute. Trade and culture exchange, number 3. Makikita na ito yung magiging primary focus ng talk natin, where we see how musical forms, the material forms of musical instruments transform because of foreign elements. And then lastly, yung subject of musical identities. one thing na pwedeng mabigay sa atin ng archaeomusicology that ethnomusicology cannot provide us are the traditions of lost cultures. So in these examples here, we have some ancient musical notation, some of the oldest. Yung isa dito is a Sumerian clay tablet of the Hurrian hymn, 1400 BC. And then yung isa dito is a fragment of the Orestes, nakalagay sa papyrus, dated to 408 BC. These are ancient musical notation. Yan. Now, what does archaeomusicology look at? Daling sabihin, it's music, pero there's more to it than that. Unang-una, archaeometry and reconstructive archaeology. As an archaeomusicologist, we don't have the benefit of performing with the instruments that we get from archaeology. One, these are either in a state of very, very poor preservation, lalo na yung gawa sa natural materials. Second, performing on a very, very old instrument or a museum piece is generally not advised kasi you are likely to cause damage to it. So with archaeometry, yung archaeology of measurements and yung reconstruction, we can create proxies for these instruments. Second, archaeoacoustics, archaeology of sound. Now, this is an interesting one kasi at what point does sound start and at what point does music begin? For example, yung tambuli, yung Carabao horn trumpet natin, madalas ginagamit siya for the purposes of calling elders to a meeting. Ibig sabihin, yung sound na ginagawa mo for that context isn't necessarily for music, and yet it falls into the category of archaeomusicology through archaeoacoustics. Next, yung archaeocryptography. So ito yung mga notation systems and yung mga motifs na makikita natin dun sa instruments and related things themselves. And lastly, ethnoarchaeology. Napaka-importante nito in cases like the Philippines, Southeast Asia, other tropical countries, because a lot of musical instruments are created from perishable materials. So unfortunately, they don't survive well in the archaeological context. So for a lot of these, we can only look at ethnoarchaeological artifacts. Although merong mga exceptions to that we will be looking at today. Now, for the focus of this talk, what we are going to talk about is yung effects of culture, exchange, and adaptation dun sa mga musical traditions of the Philippines and elsewhere. So how did material culture and music change as a result of colonial incursion and other external forces? Tignan natin unang-una yung mga flutes here in the Philippines. So there are three primary styles of flutes in the Philippines, documented by pioneering ethnographic work. Down south, meron tayo nung tinatawag ng mga lip valley flutes, like the pulala or the palendang. So very long, and then yung mouthpiece niya is cut at an angle, and then you blow across this to produce a sound. The other form are the ring flutes, parang katulad ng suling. So meron siya ng same notch na yun, but the air is focused by a channel cut into the bamboo, tied off by a semi-flexible material such as rattan or bamboo strips. Pagkatapos yung second type ng flute, yung third type ng flute predominantly dominated Philippine flute music. Yung nakikita mo naman up north, such as those in the Cordillera, are nose flutes. This is an example of a kalaling. Na the flute is cut at a node, the bamboo is cut at the node, and then dun binubutas yung embouchure for the nose. It's interesting kasi when we look at the pioneering works of early ethnographers here in the Philippines, early into the 1900s, and later din dun sa mga work nila Jose Maceda, E. Arsenio Manuel, ito yung mga nakikita natin. But throughout the past 100 years, there has been a drastic change in the form of common musical instruments. Here in the center, for example, is a side-blown flute na kung ngayon madalas tawagin ng plauta. It's interesting to note that these side-blown flutes usually share a similar fingering pattern to lip valley flutes or rim-blown flutes like the pulala or the palendang. Pero yung mouthpiece na ginagamit niya is side-blown, transverse flute like the Western concert flute. Now, this is fascinating kasi one of the hypotheses dun sa phenomenon na to, kung bakit nagtra-transition na tayo towards this side-blown form of flute is because local people are being trained, before going into traditional music, they are primarily trained in the Western convention. So these are easier to adopt. Unfortunately, as a result of that, there's less demand for the production of really true traditional flutes like the palendang. It's also interesting because I see this often discussed by musician circles who talk about lip valley flutes and rim-blown flutes as very, very difficult to play. They're difficult to play kasi a lot of us are trained to play traverso, transverse style. But if you grew up with the lip valley flutes, hindi yun. Here's another very interesting example. Ito talagang natuwa ako nung nakita ko to when we were visiting the Museum of Three Cultures sa Cagayan de Oro. So it's also labeled a pulala. Yung dito sa right side ng presentation ko. It looks like it's tuned like a pulala based on the finger holes, but the sound production mechanism is extremely different. In fact, the sound production mechanism it uses is the same as either the European flageolet or yung mga later Native American flutes na makikita mo in North America. Na meron kang slow air chamber to direct the air to the blade. And then here's another one, yung mga fipple flutes. So, yung pinakita ko kanina, the one in these pictures here is the suling. So, the suling is a ring flute na yung air niya dinidirect towards the blade using the flexible material na nakatali na around the tube. This sound production mechanism is very similar to yung tinatawag ng mga fipple sa recorders kung pag-uusapan natin ng European Convention. And it's interesting because from the 80s onward, we see this intermediate form of flute springing up here in the Philippines where you have that deep channel like a recorder and you still have that ring flute construction, pero instead of using a semi-flexible material, the channel is cut into the bamboo or you either use a ring slipped over the main shaft of the flute. So kung gusto nyo maging familiar dito, yung pinakamadalas kong makitang example of these are the king flute na madalas ina-assign sa mga grade school students for music class. Yan. And then the boat flutes of the Philippines. This is another interesting example. Before anything, there's something I have to mention na ang dami nating boat flutes here in the Philippines. There's this misconception na when you see a boat flute, maririnig ko agad, oh, it's a kudyapi. Kudyapi is just one form of boat flute and ang dami-daming ibang forms. Different names, yung kuglung, yung kudyapi, paglung, piyapi, tiyapi, heglung, ang dami nun. And they all have these minor differences between them. But they share similar characteristics, of course, being classified into boat flutes. So boat flutes are constructed from a single piece of wood, usually. And then yung sound production mechanism niya are two strings. So one serves as the drone, meron kang string na nagpe-play lang in the background serving as accompaniment. And then you have what you call a melody string. The melody string plays the lead melody dun sa rhythmic strumming na ginagawa mo. And ito yung fascinating. Dun tayo sa melody string mag-focus. Kasi merong I'm not an expert on boat flutes of the Philippines. I highly recommend this publication by Hans Brandeis sa Boat Flutes of the Philippines, same title. It's free to download online if you search it there. Pero merong mga traditional tunings that are used based on the spacing of the frets. And what's interesting about these frets is they're usually made of bamboo. and they are movable, held together or held onto the instrument by beeswax. Ngayon yung mga makikita mo to make them compatible to Western music or contemporary styles, you're going to see arrangements that are tailored to that. Minsan makikita mo naka-arrange na sila sa mga Western pentatonic scales, diatonic scales. Some of the more extreme versions are even completely chromatic. Ito a very, very modified version of a boat lute is shown here dun sa far right, held by Bava Mitra sa Kadangyan Band, a neo-folk band in Cebu, na meron siyang 6 strings like a guitar, and then you have a full chromatic fretboard across the neck. So ibang-iba na talaga yung playing style niya. What's interesting is we have this incursion of external influence dun sa mga sarili nating instruments, but we also have this incursion of local influence towards Western instruments. An example of this is the bandurria. Hindi ko nalagay sa slide, but there's one over here in the background if you look at my window. The bandurria in the European context has 12 strings set in 6 courses, but the Philippine bandurria has 14 strings. And then we also carried over this idea of melody strings, na yung first 6 strings natin are set in courses of 2. And then there's that notion again na yung mga high strings na yun are used primarily for the melody. Yan. Going outside of the Philippines, ito na yung mga makikita natin sa archaeology. Kasi these instruments here are example of instruments that are preserved in the archaeological context. So jaw harps or juice harps, kung sa Pilipinas tawagan natin kubing. The earliest examples of these instruments have been found in the region around the northeast China to the Altai Mountains. And then makikita mo to very prominently throughout the archaeology across the Silk Road. So merong theory ng dalawang waves na migration of the juice harps out of its place of origin. The first one is before the Silk Road, and then the second one is after the Silk Road. Merong dalawang types of that I will show, but for this one, tignan muna natin yung first type, which is the heteroglot form or the key-shaped form. So it's interesting kasi, well, this case is interesting, particularly in the Rajasthani tradition of the Morchang, which is region north of India. Isa to sa mga instruments sila na one of the running hypotheses ngayon is that is the earliest instance of this key-shaped form of the juice harps that traveled to the Silk Road in Europe. So at the very left here is an example of the traditional Rajasthani Morchang. Over here at the center left is an example of the earlier juice harps found in Europe and later on into the Americas, as early as the medieval, the most post-medieval period. And then later on, nagkaroon na rin ng sariling developments in Europe. So itong nasa center right natin is a typical example of a mustache-style juice harp found in England. Now, India became a European colony. And yung interesting dito is we have this transition again of instrument style, where you have the traditional makers in Rajasthan borrowing the form of the style na naging uso sa Victorian England. So it went around in a circle. A similar phenomenon happened in Vietnam, where you have the second form of juice harps. Ito yung mas familiar sa atin, called the idioglot. So 2 forms. When we say idioglot, it's made from one piece. Like our kubing or yung mga danmoy of the Hmong people. Gawa lang siya sa single piece of brass. We have something similar in the Philippines with the ifugao na gawa din sa brass. Archaeologically, this was all we had in Vietnam. Yung mga ganyan na idioglot forms. Interestingly, with manufacturing growing in Vietnam, and with communication with Western countries din, those same places of manufacture started to create heteroglot forms of the instruments as those seen here on the right. So na-adopt din nila yung form na yun that was common in the European context. Now, this is fascinating how we have this interchange of forms, considering na dalawa yung migration of the jaw harp na meron tayong through the Silk Road into Europe, and then yung earlier na mga idioglot forms going down into Southeast Asia and up into the Altai Mountains. In the modern world, naghalo-halo na eh. And it's important to look at it from an archaeological context in order for us to better see the actual movement of the instrument. And another similar example na nangyari dun is with the ocarina. The ocarina is actually a very young term. And yet, an example of this top of mind na naiisip ko is an quote-unquote ocarina excavated by Olof Janse in 1939 in Vietnam. So this ocarina was dated to the 13th was dated along a 13th century burial. Pero this instrument isn't actually an ocarina, rather it's a form of a shun, a vessel flute that predated the ocarina. So yung mga vessel flutes, they're usually made out of ceramic, kaya sila nagsusurvive well in the archaeological context. And there are many cases of independent invention throughout the world. Some of the oldest examples are in China in the form of the shun, and the South American vessel flutes that we see with the that we see in South America. Yung modern form of the ocarina na kilala ngayon was actually created in the 1800s by Giuseppe Donati, and this was also when the term was coined. Yung interesting dito is we have that very early term for the word ocarina, and yet yung mga cultures ng mga gawa ng instrument na yun, even before that, started adopting this term. So suddenly all vessel flutes are erroneously, well, mahirap sabihin na erroneously kasi in-adopt nga yung term, are now being called ocarinas, even though typologically they're different instruments. Another example of how these instruments were influenced by trade was as a result of the growth of tradeware coming out from China into Europe. So blue and whites na pumapasok dun sa Europe, na-impluensyahan din yung mga local manufacturers of the instruments, most prominently in sa Mason Company sa Germany. Around the 1700s to 1800s, they started adopting that blue and white motif on their ocarinas. And what's interesting is that later on into contemporary time, yung style na yun of using a European ocarina with the blue and white motif was adopted by cultures who were creating ocarinas even before the ocarina was an ocarina. Like yung isang modern example here is a blue and white ocarina by the modern maker Merrick out of China. Na in-adopt din nila yung form na yun, similar to the ones from Mason. Circular siya. Bumalik lang din ulit. Ayan. Last point I have to make is meron akong interesting observation dito sa effects of tourism on instrument manufacturing. Kasi, eto, let's just look at the examples to explain. On the top picture, we have an ethnographic kubing versus tourist-grade kubing. So the ethnographic one was created by a musician from Marawi. And then yung kubing is one of the kubing that you can get from souvenir stores or mga palengke like in Baguio, which are usually created in Cotabato. Isa yun dun sa mga places that mass-produce these. And it's interesting kasi a lot of the instrument changes. Unang-una, the form is simplified. The motifs used are drastically changed. A lot of them are non-traditional anymore. And then the species of bamboo used in the instrument has even changed. So dito sa top example from the Marawi musician, you have an instrument made out of a slow-growing bamboo. And then yung tourist grade example here that are usually sourced from Cotabato are made from a faster-growing cane. So pati yun nag-iba. Sa baba naman, we have the kalaling, yung mga um, nose flutes of the Ifugao sa Cordillera. So yung top two dito are ethnographic examples actually used in the musical context. And then yung bottom two, tourist grade examples created for Tamawan Museum sa Baguio. Tamawan Village sa Baguio. Although they are reliable to the construction and the species of bamboo, yung motifs nag-iba drastically, and they were also finished very differently. Apart from having different carvings that are really non-traditional anymore, the instruments were also varnished. So to end this talk, I will leave you with things to ponder, things that I ponder myself. This adaptation of traditional music in the contemporary context, is it helpful in a way that it makes music more accessible to the contemporary musician? Or is it harmful in the sense that it dilutes musical tradition to conform to Western standards of music? So, ayun, I can't answer those questions. Mga things lang naiisip ko whether or not this adaptation is helpful or harmful to the future of ethnomusicology in the Philippines. And with that, I wrap up my talk.
Thank you so much, Kim. All right. So this juncture, our organizers will bring everyone back for the open forum. And I'm sure Kim is already in conversation with Dr. Sen Nicolas because Sir Sen has been doing a lot of studies in ethnomusicology. It's good to see you, Sir Sen. All right. So our speakers this afternoon, if you have questions, please post it in our Zoom or our Facebook. Our speakers, Professor Rosella Torrecampo, Professor John Hontanar, Curator John, or our ASP graduate student, Kim Reyes, also Curator Roland Macawili, my apologies. And also we would like to also call Dr. Victor Paz to join us to have a very, very interesting and lively discussion this afternoon, just like in the morning. All right. So anyway, we have a couple of questions already sent to us by our organizers. The first one is for Dr. Torrecampo, Professor Torrecampo. Dr. Torrecampo, I am Justin from UST Grad School, living in Silang, Cavite. My question is, are there any written accounts or records regarding the Chinese workers in Chican, Silang? Did their beliefs shifted to the beliefs of the people of Silang?
Uh-huh. On one hand, there is only one record, at least, that I've come across orally when they talked about the origin of the barrio in Chican itself as being a Chinese enclave. There is one, I think, about somebody who I forget the name at the moment, but who acted as a revolutionary also and joined forces with the Caviteños. But other than that, not that I really know of that there is one. For one, I think that if you go to Barrio in Chica now, not that you can see that there is a predominance of people living there who will readily trace their looks and their, of course, heritage to the Chinese. But it seems that in the legend that I came across, which is more of an etiological or a toponymic, the reason why the Chinese were enclosed within that area is something, again, that has to do with self and others. They were treated very much like the way the Chinese in Parian, I suppose, were treated by segregating them. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Torrecampo. By the way, that question came from Justin Tamonte. And now we have a question for Professor John Ray Hontanar from Ray Macapagal. Based on your presentation, or in contrast to your presentation, The Agi have infiltrated or are deemed important in the Catholic Church in more recent times. For example, they are important in the beautification of churches during fiestas and other occasions. Does the queer literature of Western Visayas reflect this? From Ray Macapagal.
Thank you, sir, for your question. I think we cannot deny that Kaagian has infiltrated many spaces in society, even the church. The Agi plays a paradoxical performance because he is marginalized, yet he is central in certain spaces. Like what you said, the art of beautification or beautifying the church, or during the Lenten season, during the fiestas, etc. Even the term agi has evolved beyond gender. Now, anything that connotes hyperfemininity or anything associated to the art of camp is associated with kaagian. So to answer your query regarding this matter, I don't think any writer in the Western Visayan region has written about it yet, but I'm sure this phenomenon will be documented in literature sooner or later.
Thank you, Professor Hontanar. Sir Vic, just let me know if you want to ask questions or anytime, sir. Sir, you're muted. Oh, you're muted, po. Sir Vic, you're muted, po. Opo. Okay.
No, I have many questions, Migs, but I was
sir.
just wondering, maybe you want to carry on with
Okay, sir.
reading the questions first for everyone, then.
Sure, sir. Okay.
And I'm sorry, our senior here has a lot of questions for Kim.
Definitely. Okay. Question actually for Kim from Po Taton, or rather, Jim Ilibiran first, and then Po Taton. So from Jim, from your lecture, also from ethnoarchaeological documentations of boat loots by Hans Brandes, I hope I said that right. Can you describe the extent of cultural loss we will suffer if the production of these traditional musical instruments stopped because of low market value and disinterest by the new generation of Filipinos?
This links to yung dilution of tradition that I was speaking of. Kasi there's still somewhat of a market for boat lutes here in the Philippines. Dun sa mga circles that I'm on, for example, if you're on, you can check out this Facebook group, Folk Musicians Philippines. Madalas meron pa rin exchange nitong mga boat lutes na to. It's more of a matter of whether or not we preserve the traditional form of the boat lutes. Kasi nga yung nangyayari is, there is this production, this commercial production of boat lutes, but the forms have drastically changed. Yung mga tuning pegs na normally mga flexion tuners that are made of large wood, napapalitan na sila ng mga contemporary geared tuners or contemporary metal friction tuners. The fret, sometimes they're not movable anymore. Sometimes yung tuning nila nag-iiba talaga. And ayun nga, like the thinking point that I left with earlier, I'm not sure how to answer the question, whether or not that's good for making it compatible for the context of Western music, or is it harmful na dinadilute natin yung tradition of creating boat lutes. Tapos, on that note, yung mga ginagawang boat lutes that are accurate quote-unquote to tradition aren't usually created for commercial purposes. These are made by musicians for the musicians. So it's not a standard as like a guitar na makukuha mo. You need to know people to acquire one. Unfortunately, I wish that would change. And I wish merong way na pwede nating gawin yun. So that we don't dilute the traditional forms of these instruments.
Thank you, Kim. Yes, sir, Vic. You raise your hand.
No, well, I have questions and queries for everyone, but maybe I should start with Roland because Ronald, wala pang question for or comment for Ronald. A very important topic, Ginhawa, no, and very deep philosophically, I will have to say. I was just wondering, first, there's a clarification that citation, Ronald, on Ginhawa's defined as stomach. It was defined stomach in English. Where's the citation again?
In Spanish.
Spanish. Okay.
From ano nga yun, isang Spaniard ang gumawa ng dictionary na yun.
San Buenaventura? Is it in San Buenaventura?
No. It is defined as estomago.
Tomago, okay. Because that's, for me, if there's two more examples like that in dictionaries, then especially if you get injured, right? Let's say you got hit in the head or you have a scratch. Ano yung kasabihan, di ba? Oh, malayo sa bituka yan, di ba? Bituka. And we all know this, and this has been in the discourse of Ginhawa. But I'm also interested if what's your view about if we are going to create an opposite of Ginhawa, is gutom a proper opposite of Ginhawa?
Ang unawa ko po kasi dyan sa Ginhawa, napakalawak niyang konsepto na halos iba't ibang konsepto rin ang nasa ilalim niya. Halimbawa yung pagkabusog, minsan yung mismong buhay, yung mismong paghinga. Ang gutom siguro as direct opposite ng Ginhawa ay hindi aakma, hindi sasapat para tukuyin, no?
Yeah, no. Although of course, ang gutom hindi naman necessarily mamamatay ka sa gutom eh.
Sa gutom.
Parang deprived ka lang, no? And which sa akin, maybe you should also look at pag-isipan mo rin yung concept of Ginhawa is very central sa atin. But is it a question of nostalgia even during the time of Bonifacio and Rizal? Is it it's a nostalgia for perceived past, right? Because there was no ideal past. I mean, for heaven's sake, grabe nga buhay nung araw, and lalo na kung alipin ka, di ba? At so, but there is this notion of an ideal past, right? Like a utopian concept of a past where there's Ginhawa. But whether it really happened in the past, we of course doubt that. No such thing. But it is really the ideal. That's the ideal. And then so I have many other questions and comments but for Professor Hontanar, fascinating view about the Agi and the Babaylan, and of course I will say since the late 80s, the appropriation of Babaylan by the gay movement has taken place and then has moved on very quickly. Is an Agi always a camp person? Can you be Agi without being camp?
Not really, sir. But compared to the Agi compared to the Manila Bakla still remains feminine. He does not allow himself to have pluralities when it comes to expression of identity. That's what that certain element makes him unique compared to other indigenous articulations of homosexuality in the country.
Correct. So that means you can be Agi, but not necessarily gay. Is that, do I understand it correctly? Or let's say you're an Agi man, and but you still prefer women sexually. I mean, or I'm misunderstanding you in your thinking that Agi, in your interpretation of Agi as beyond sexuality, right? I was just thinking, what's your view about that?
The Agi is a gender expression. It's like the gay men in a Western context. But unlike the gays in the Western world who have been queered by modernity, some gays are into masculine gays, like a masculine gay man can desire a masculine gay man. The Agi's attendant performance is very binaristic because he expresses himself in feminine ways, in various feminine ways. Thus, the sexuality or the gender performance that is desired by the Agi is someone who is masculine because he considers himself as feminine. So that level of femininity varies from subtle to flamboyant to extreme campy expressions of femininity.
And Katao is Serena, tama ba?
Serena, sir, yeah. Similar to the
Thank you very
Serena.
much. Thank you. Thank you. Mix, may tanong ako sa lahat, pati comments, pero if no one, just interrupt me anytime. Arsenio, just interrupt me if you, but in the case of in the case of Professor Torrecampo's paper, which again, I'm, if you were listening to my talk earlier, I'm fascinated by this phenomena of the nasa Senora, is it of Silang, no? In the Candelaria, which in the same building, in the same time, in the same church, it has a different representation up front, very starkly different from the one inside by the altar, or it has its own altar, I suppose. But may I ask if is there a conscious dictation of representation of the Virgin, and what is the original Virgin? I mean, is it like a Immaculate Conception, or before it became a Nuestra Señora of Silang? What is it? Where is it closest to in the traditional Roman Catholic iconographic representation?
So in Silang, sir, we are told that the Virgin was found by a man inside a chest somewhere in a field, and that was that which was installed at the facade of the church. So that seems that she has primacy, although, as we have said, for lack of hands-on ability to examine the very icon, we don't know even if she's wooden or stone. So we assume she's wooden.
So there's a taboo. No one has actually
in recent times. Yes, I think she was installed sometime already in the 1800s as well. I'm not so very sure about the installation, but I'll have to check on that. But at least the date, which is supposedly her installation significantly or symbolically, is the date of the founding of the church, 1595. However, the Madonna inside the church is as generic as can get. Look at all the representation, say from Haro, from Candelaria, Quezon, and from all other churches. And you might as well say that's a Santo maker who produced that kind of Madonna. So in that regard, the stories actually reference more the woman there ensconced at the facade by saying that she's the one who walks because she can leave the case that she has been sealed in. And therefore, that is a greater miracle than maybe the one who is seen as the ceremonial representation. That's why I also see this, sir, as a sort of dichotomy between yung pangtahanan talaga, yung pangbahay mo, yung true self mo, as opposed to yung pambisitang inihaharap mo. No? So bihis na bihis ka, pero hanggang pambisita ka lang. And that is the ceremonial regard, I suppose, that she is given.
And during Holy Week, when people want to recharge their anting-anting, where do they go? To the one outside or inside?
Sir, hindi po dyan. Not to the church, and it's still happening now. Of late, we had just seen something done. Dun po kayo sa mga, what the Ilonggos would call the mariit na lugar. So in our cases, the secret places, the deep ravines where there is a river, particularly where foliage abounds, and that's where the magic is. So the church, as we say, sanitizes that supposedly, and that's her function also, we presuppose. No?
And last query, antipatico. Could you describe some of the tropes as an antipaticong sagot?
Yes, sir. Yung pilosopo, di ba, sir? Yung parang nambabastos ka pero hindi ka nahalatang nambabastos.
Nambabastos.
Pero madalas
kung mahuli ka sa gano'n, mas gulpi ka.
Yes, yes, certainly. And therefore, it presupposes an utter lack of facility in the language, no,
That's
by
right.
the other or the foreigner.
It's a very good thesis you have. That's really an everyday form of resistance. The torps that you mentioned. And then Kim, I don't know if you have you talked to Dr. Nicolas. You haven't met him before, no? He's one of the early musicologists we have. He used to be a student of Professor Maceda too, a long time ago. But but if you went to gongs, you know, he wrote things about gongs, of course, which I think you intentionally didn't go to gongs, but you also didn't go to xylophones, no? So xylophones, of course, is another musical form, instrument form that's very much. Roger Blanche has argued it's like very primordially Austronesian and all. But I just want to say, you know, because I know your passion is in it and everything. Do you really like to see it as a incursion of influence? It's in your title and it's in your discussion. To say it's incursion, that means the people who are using it and transforming it they're doing it by force or it's unwanted, as opposed to you are modifying, right, your musical instruments because you're adapting it, you know, to the tourist industry and everything, and or you're making your changes to suit your own personal preferences with music. But I'm not afraid of it, of all of this, because at the end it will survive. It needs to survive. And I will look at Western instrumentality for that. There are many early forms of piano that are not with us anymore, and guitars, but through the use of the musicians and of course the support of patrons and subsidies of institutions, then that perhaps will be my answer to your question, no, that you floated, about whether it's good or bad. Maybe it's not that it's good or bad, but if you have a choice, then it's an advocacy that you push for that kind of advocacy so it will survive. But fascinating talks. Learn a lot from everyone. Really. Mix, I blurted all of my questions and queries now, so maybe
Okay, sir.
others do.
Breathe muna, breathe. Okay, sir. Let's have Iggy Espinosa. A question for Professor Hontanar. Mayad na hapon sa tanan, si Iggy mula sa University of Antique, TLMC. Katanungan kay Sir Hontanar, kung agi ang katawan or katawagan sa gay sa panay, ano ang katawagan sa lesbian? Ang narinig ko sa local ay tumba patis. Hindi ba ito po ay idioms? Tama ba ito?
Thank you, sir, for your question. I have not really ventured into lesbian studies. Lesbian literature in the Philippines is kind of subtle compared to how the lad exploded in the 90s. But credits to our lesbian.
Professor? Na putol pa yata. Professor Hontanar?
Naghang lang yung ano niya.
Baka mag-reboot. Okay. Sige, sir.
Pero nga, hindi pala, very specific pala ang agi, hindi pa for gay men rather than, I thought it can be used across genders, no? Hindi pala. Okay.
Siguro po at this point, wala na po si Professor. So let's move muna to the next question.
Yan.
Okay.
Sorry.
Welcome back. Okay, welcome back.
Sorry, it's the Wi-Fi got disconnected. I was saying, I think the term tomboy is being used colloquially, but it's borrowed from from how the Manileños would label their lesbians. I think a more appropriate and local term is lakinon, but the lesbian discourse in Western Visayas is not really explored compared to the gay literary depictions. But lesbian writers in the region have been writing strongly about lesbian representations, and hopefully in the future someone will get to study about the history of lesbian writing and lesbian representation in Western Visayas.
Thank you, Professor Hontanar. Now a question from Po Taton for Kim. Kim, how extensive in terms of research had been done in Philippine archaeomusicology? I think archaeomusicology share many facets with organology, and I would like to know the current status of the field. Thank you.
Yes, unfortunately, in the Philippines, it's still a very young discourse. No? Kasi nga, one of the limitations na mention ko kanina is the material involved in these instruments are usually perishable. As for works that are approaching archaeomusicology, entering from organology, yung pinaka-extensive na study na nakita ko was a collection of scientific illustrations from collection of scientific illustrations from E. Arsenio Manuel na mga I forget the term, no? Exploded views of musical instruments and their function, and yung construction nila and the sound producing mechanism. But this was way back in the 1940s. In the contemporary context, we have the likes of Hans Brandes from Berlin, speaking on both lutes. But in the Philippine context talaga, there's still a lot to be looked into.
All right, thank you, Kim. So from the other Arsenio Manuel. Okay, another question from Po Taton, this time to Professor John Hontanar. Since Agi is likened to the Babaylan, can you consider Agi as a performance and that the expression of kaagian is reserved for Babaylan-related functions? Or can it extend to encompass various forms of performativity that are beyond the Babaylan?
Thank you, sir. It's not just chained within the Babaylanic tradition. Kaagian is not just a performance, but also an identification, an expression of self. And the Agi writers just use the Babaylan iconography to empower the Agi identity, because the first chapter, or the beginning of gay literature in the Philippines, we can really see how homosexual identities were super subjugated. The bakla identity was suffering, and I think it's a political move. It's a personal, conscious decision for Agi writers to go to the pre-colonial past and find a powerful image to use and incorporate in the writing to decolonize the narrative of gay representation in the region. So it's not just exclusive to Babaylanism. I think it's a multitude of things.
Okay, thank you, Professor Hontanar. We have Dr. Michelle Eusebio. Question for Kim. Can we see syncretization in musical instruments during and after colonial incursions?
Sorry, what was that? Can you see?
Can we see syncretization in musical instruments during and after colonial incursions?
Wait lang. I will have to look up that word. Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with
syncretization.
Syncretization.
It's like the mixing, parang Parang nagluluto ka ng chop suey. Halo-halo ang ingredients from different elements.
Ah,
Mhm.
sorry. Okay, can you repeat the question, sir?
Sure, Akim. Can we see syncretization in musical instruments during and after colonial incursions? From Dr. Michelle Eusebio.
Yes. Yun nga, like yung isang pinakita kong example here with the, para mas visual tayo, with the Rajasthani jaw harps, na meron kang traditional forms, and then once you get into the yung colonial period sa India, nagkaroon ka din ng mga forms that were similar to the Victorian forms in seen in Europe, seen in England, Victorian England. Here in the Philippines, madami, like yun nga yung mga nakita ko, primarily in the methods of sound production, nag-iba when it comes to sa mga flutes, for example.
Thank you, Kim. Sir Vic, do you have any questions for?
Yeah, sundan ko lang. Kim, what's your I know Dr. Nicolas's views about this a long time ago, but what is your view now, because you are a practitioner and a student of musicology, in that movement, for example, of standardizing tonality, no? In, let's say, the gamelan, no? Arsenio, who's that group again? Yung tinono yung mga gongs niya?
It's difficult. Gongs are very difficult to standardize because the material itself cannot be, the sound quality is not fixed. It has so many overtones. So you cannot peg it to a particular tone.
Wasn't there a group who did it?
Well, there are people in America and elsewhere who.
Someone in the Conservatory of Music, College of Music, I'm sorry.
No, what I want to say is something like this. All over, you see the gamelan is the most popular now of all the gong ensembles. And the problem is that in America, they are doing it in different ways, also in Europe, in Britain, and in Japan. And even here in Thailand, the gongs here are constantly being attacked by Western music. So the tendency is for the Thai pipat or for the gamelan to adapt to Western tuning, and not vice versa, because it's much easier in quotation marks for the musicians to do that. But there is always a problem. The problem is the tuning. If you hear the gongs play with the symphony orchestra, they are just jarring because the overtones are very strong. As compared to a symphony orchestra where the overtones are not very strong because they are controlled. But the gongs are different. The gongs are quite different. And on that note, also, I want to comment on Mr. Reyes' presentation, which is very informative in terms of the organological aspects of the instrument. And that is also the problem, because we don't have competent people to actually transmit all the knowledge of the musics of the Philippines. It is different from Thailand and Indonesia and Cambodia, Laos, and Burma, and Japan, and Korea, where traditional music, and India, where traditional music is so sacred. You cannot change it. Right? There are institutions, government institutions, religious institutions in the temples that guard the tradition. Of course, there are people who change it. But the change is very temporary, because the ancient tradition is very strong. Now we don't have that in the Philippines because our history is very different from that of Southeast Asia. We didn't have, we were not a big empire. We were only islands, okay? And that goes through with the paper of the Tagalogs this morning when he was talking about whether he is from Borneo or from Luzon. At that time, there was no Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia. These were all small entities. So what happens is that we don't have that big institution to, at the present time, to guard what we call now as traditions. So that is the given fact. That is not the problem. That is the given fact. The problem is, what do you do with that? What do you do with these things? First, you have to have people who will really have to study, really study. And from there, we still have the old masters around. If you go back to the provinces, you can ask the musicians to teach you. And you have to stay there. You know what is fascinating about the Americans and the Europeans? They stay in Java for years, in Bali for years, just to learn the gamelan. And also the British and the Japanese as well. They do that. They study for 4 years, 5 years, 6 years. But we don't have Filipinos who can do that. That is not our thinking, because our thinking is always change. We always change. Our culture is not pegged. Our culture is not pegged. Just like what Mr. Reyes was saying, the tuning of the kujapi, they don't use beeswax anymore. So you cannot adjust the tuning of the string. The pegs are now permanent. So the tones are permanent. But in the kujapi, you use beeswax, so you can adjust. You can adjust the tuning.
Mm.
So this is a question of permanence and impermanence.
By the way, who coined the term boat lutes for all of this?
Oh, it's an old term.
Because it's a bit loaded for me to call it boat lutes. I mean, just because of the imagery that it gives out.
Well, the other term is two-string lute. Because there are 3 strings and there are 4 strings. Okay?
So it cannot be two-string lute.
Well, what we have are 2 strings only. That, just like what Mr. Ray was saying, one is a drone string and one is the melody string. But if you go to Borneo, the sampe has 3 strings. One is a drone string, and 2 are melody strings. So these are just technical matters, so it's not very important. But I like the way Mr. Reyes illustrated the intricacy of instruments, how especially the flutes, they're very fascinating. There's so many kinds of flutes, and yes, those are my comments. But can I have another comment, please?
Yes,
I am
please go
very
ahead.
much pleased to hear all the papers today.
All right, thank you,
I
sir.
miss the Philippines.
I thought you had another comment.
That's it.
That's it.
Because I learned a lot from all the papers today.
Yeah.
I think
About
Kim
Like
wants to
I-
react.
I had the chance to read about the Tagalog and Philippine studies for a long time. And I'm so immersed with mainland Southeast Asia, with Thailand, Cambodia, and Laos, and China now. And so it's so refreshing to hear lahat ng mga...
Yeah.
Kim, you wanted to react?
Jump in. Thank you very much, Sir Nicholas, Sir Vic.
All right, that's it. Ruben, you have something to say?
Yes, thank you, sir. Jumping in on the topic, my feeling of how we tune instruments to the Western context. Sir Vic, you were mentioning this group earlier that tuned gongs. I think you might be referring to Kontragapi.
No, Contragapi is more jazz and very loyal to the concept of there's no tyranny of the composer. But there was another group that, wow, if you listen to their toned gamelan, it's, from my unlearned ear, it's easy to listen to. It's like you're listening to a xylophone.
Yeah, because
But then I remember, I think Arsenio was one of those who was already commenting. I just couldn't remember. They're professional musicians, but they shave they really fix their gongs so that they are in proper tonality or tune. But I couldn't remember the name of the group. No, it's not Contragapi. Contragapi is jazz.
The reason I mentioned that is that they have this performance using gong ensembles, and then they played the theme song of what is the title of this show? It's a very popular show with dragons and medieval fantasy. Hang on, it's on the tip of my tongue.
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones. They did the cover of the theme song of Game of Thrones with true.
Yeah.
Coming from that note, from perspective on tuning, I believe that the idea of tuning isn't necessarily bad. It's more of a matter of context.
Mhm.
It's more of a question of whether or not do we need to tune? Is there a need to tune an instrument, or is there no need to do it? For example, if we consider yung babalikan ko yung sa paper ko kanina, Johar playing traditions, we can compare the traditions from Rajasthan to the traditions that we see in the Altai Mountains in Russia. Rajasthan is very melodic. They focus on very clean notes. So I'm not sure if you pick up just a microphone, but the playing style, it's almost like singing. But if we compare that to example, yung instruments that we see in the Altai regions in Russia, where the context of the J harp is more shamanic, more trance, more. It's not about the cleanliness of notes. It's about being lost in the sound. It's about being lost in the overtones. So one needs to be tuned, the other one doesn't need to be tuned. So ganun din sa when do we need to tune gongs? Is it bad that we tune music? Not necessarily, kasi if it helps in such a way that we make it understandable to people who are used to Western musical conventions, then that's fantastic. But at the same time, there are contexts that we don't need it. So, context.
Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. But may I segue to a very important topic, which I'm really interested to find out the opinion or the views of from Silang and the study of Silang culture, Professor Torrecampo, and from Panay, and the study of literature, even not necessarily the Babaylan, but the concept of Ginhawa. So, what is your view on this? Now, on the discourse that Ronald has introduced to us in his paper. It's a discourse that's been going on for some decades now, but ever so being better articulated as we go on, through the years. But what's your view about this, Professor Torrecampo and Professor Hontanar? What is your view about Ginhawa and I suppose juxtaposed to your own interests, your own research, your own studies, and your own general take on it?
If I may start, sir?
Yes, please.
If we base it on the lore of Silang or their expressions of their beliefs, Ginhawa is easily attached not only to the physical body and the spiritual welfare as well. But also maybe because Silang has ever since been a rich town, always to the discovery of treasure led to them by supernatural means. So when the Virgin manifests and asks the children to lift the flooring of the church, ayan, giginhawa ang buhay mo. And that is also an often used expression, no, in the tales, ay makahanap ng ginhawa, giginhawa ang buhay.
Ang galing. I like that. Oh,
Yeah.
ano tingin mo doon, Ronald? Ang galing.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Prior to the question, maybe Professor Hontanar, do you have a take on it?
Ginhawa in a Panayanan sense, sir, is not just about having a bountiful life, having like a stress-free existence. It's also connected with breathing, being able to breathe. And to be able to breathe is also connected with that utopian worldview. And the role of Babaylan in pre-colonial times, and even in contemporary times, in Antique, for example, where Babaylanic tradition is still strong, they bring kaginhawaan to the lives of the people because they are mediators between the human realm and the ancestral spirits, the animistic forces. So people always have incantations, practices that pay homage to the unseen forces in order for them to achieve a bountiful harvest or to have to achieve that ginhawa.
And is it also Ginhawa in Panay languages, or how do you say it in Panay? Is it also Ginhawa? What is the word? Professor Hontanar?
We have a lot of terms, sir. It's not just ginhawa.
Equivalents, right? Or yeah. Do you remember an example of a very similar?
I can't think of any right now.
Okay, when you do remember, please do shout it later.
Okay.
Ang galing. I like that.
Curator Macawili, you wanted to also react?
Yes, sir.
Yes, go ahead.
Kaya nga dun sa aking paper, I made a statement that, well, of course, yung ginhawa dapat talaga munang maramdaman ng katawan. And to that, I even commented that notion na ang ginhawa dapat munang maramdaman ng katawan, that gives a very materialist flavor sa ginhawa. Kasi minsan sa ibang literature, agad-agad tumutukoy ito sa utopia. Pero hindi, dapat ang ginhawa, maranasan mo ngayon at dito na.
Yes. Oo.
Ngayon at dito na. Kasi yung religious flavors ng ginhawa, sa tingin ko na idagdag na lang yan because of our experiences with religion, na wala dito ang ginhawa, ang buhay sa daigdig ay preparasyon lamang sa isang ginhawa doon sa kabilang buhay.
Maaari nga, no? So you're saying mas tingin mo yung original essence niya, mas existential, mas ngayon, here and now.
Yes, here and now po.
Okay.
At doon kay Professor Torrecampo, yung ginhawa bilang dapat mong ma-discover yan, makita yan. I think that adds to my contention na
correct.
Materialist talaga yung ginhawa. Wala yung religious connotations na dapat doon mo sa kabilang buhay hanapin yan. And I think the question to be settled now, in addition to what Professor Paz has said, ay kung ano ba yung salin ng ginhawa, kasi may mga nagsasabi ang well-being hindi siya sasapat para tukuyin yung ginhawa. But, well, I think mukhang okay naman yung well-being as a
okay, well-being.
Okay na yung well-being. Wag na tayong mag-uwirat na parang ang Pilipinas ay nasa Mars na wala itong salin sa English.
I agree. Tingin ko well-being yung malapit. Ginawang well-being.
Okay, we have Professor Torrecampo, but just a quick announcement from the organizers. We will end at 3:40. Maybe Professor Torrecampo, and then Professor Sen, if you want to add another question, go ahead.
Yes, in my case, I'd say why settle on one when we could have the full range or nuances of the word? So halimbawa, ginhawa, when instant is relief, especially from pain or oppression that is felt. So yeah, we can welcome the whole, I suppose, gloss and the whole vocabulary for so long as we can contextualize the
Ay,
application.
laking ginhawa. That's the expression. Yun ang Tagalog sa amin. Ay, laking ginhawa.
Yes, sir. Sir Nicolas.
Sir,
Sir Nicolas.
I have one question to everyone. If you listen to music, can you feel ginhawa?
Why will they get? Why will anyone end up with Ginhawa listening to
I
that?
don't need an answer. It's just a question.
Sir, perhaps you can subscribe.
If ginhawa is a physical matter, and if sound is a physical matter,
Please subscribe Raven Kim Woodwinds.
Yes.
That's videos from Kim.
We never associated the word ginhawa with music. No, not in Tagalog.
Don't we? Oh, hold
No,
on.
I don't. Do you?
I think, sir, in Panay, ginhawa can be associated with music, like especially singing. The chanters really mastered their ginhawa in order to chant properly, in order to reach the notes, and so on.
May tanong ako, what is the emotion you take? Yung gustong-gusto natin Pinoy, yung belting, di ba? So when someone belts well, or, like Regine Velasquez or whatever, and they belt, what do we achieve? Do we achieve ginhawa? What is the emotion that raises, why people like it? I wonder, I don't know, Arcesio, what do you think? I'm just creating a counterpoint to your point that maybe with music we don't try to achieve or attain ginhawa. Maybe we do. I don't know.
Depende kung ano napakinggan mo.
Yun na nga, di ba? Sa atin, parang meron mahilig tayo sa, and tingin ko konektado sa chanting yan eh. Yung di ba, we listen to a lot of very more traditional music from Dagtas, from all these chant, where the skill is to hold your breath and to continue the as long as you can, right? The sound, it doesn't have to be a tone of sound.
Sir, if I may, di po ba sa pangharana, yung inaano natin yung pag inilalabas nung lover, yung kanyang feelings. There's a type of song that might have to do with that. At the moment, it's at the tip of my tongue. And then maybe the
kundiman? No.
Yeah, kundiman. Yes, sir. Kundi mo man ako sagutin, kundiman, ito yung pag-ibig ko. I think that brings relief to the singer, as well as the oyayi, maybe the lullaby for the child.
Yes,
the listener.
Ay, yung lullaby. Pwede nga, no? That might be to attain ginhawa. Pwede.
Yeah.
Kasi walang salitang Tagalog na ano tawag nito na ginagamit natin kung maganda ang ating pakiramdam kung nakikinig tayo sa isang musika na gustong-gusto natin. Kasi ang musika parang ano lang kung ano lang nasa nararamdaman mo sa sarili mo, what you feel, but they are not expressed in a particular word. So yun ang aking naisip kanina dahil yung ginhawa yun na nga parang laking ginhawa pero pag nakikinig ka naman ng musika hindi ka nagiginawaan ka ba o natitinag ka o nasisindak mga ganon yung mga salita natin sa Tagalog na sari-saring napakagandang yung mga kung ano ating nararamdaman.
Hindi ba yung relaxation? Hindi ba ginawa yun? Makinig muna ako sa musika sa radyo para mag-relax.
Pero wala tayong Tagalog na relax.
Hindi, baka ginawa na yun. Ronald, anong tingin mo? Papasang ginawa bang relax?
yung may isang Austronesian dictionary na sa Tagalog binibigyan niya ng kahulugan yung ginhawa as rest, no? Mukhang okay naman po yung pero sa akin kasi mukhang wala pa talagang nakakapagsulat nung concern ni Professor Nicolas ng pag-uugnay nung ginhawa sa musika. Siguro may isa dyan. Siguro si Professor Nicolas na yun na to write something about that. Kasi yun nga, valid po yung tanong na kapag tayo ba'y nakikinig sa musika, ginhawa rin ba ang ano? Ang ginhawa ay tumutukoy sa magandang pakiramdam din sa maalwang paghinga.
Maalwang paghinga yun.
Paghinga. Pwedeng ikabit-kabit pero yun po.
Okay, actually it's now 3:47. Kim, maybe you wanted to say something quickly? You're muted.
Sa salitang paghinga, interesting lang kasi isa dun sa mga documented use of the kulala is an instrument played after working in the fields at night. So yung literal na paghinga mo into the flute, parang yun yung pahinga after your hard labor.
All right, thank you, Kim. So at this point, we can officially close the open forum. It's 3:47. Again, we'd like to thank the conference organizing committee headed by Ellie Lim, Lisa Aldiano, Jane Carlos, Ara Espigar, Ana Pineda, and of course, Director D. Anthony M. Neri, our ASP director. Please do join our events slated for tomorrow. Our Session 3 and Session 4 to be moderated by Director D. Anthony Neri. At this juncture, may I turn over the mic back to Liz Aldiano. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you so much, Professor Canilao, our moderator for sessions 1 and 2, and to our session 2 speakers, Dr. Paz and to Dr. Nicolas for that very engaging discussion. And that officially ends session 2 and day 1 of our conference. On behalf of the organizing team of the 26th anniversary celebration of UP-ASP, I would like to thank everyone for joining today's sessions. And please don't forget that we still have a couple more sessions tomorrow. The Zoom link for tomorrow's sessions is the same link as today. So again, thank you so much everyone for participating to our day 1 and see you all tomorrow for our day 2 sessions. Again, I am Liz Aldiano of UP-ASP, your host for this event. We will leave the screen live for the link for about 5 minutes for the evaluation form. And thank you again. Good afternoon and stay safe.